A metal box, barely big enough for a man to stand in, much less live. 4 walls, a door with a hole for food, a hole for water, nothing more. And then, they locked him inside. Day and night, no sun, no moon, just shadows growing longer and longer, whispering lies. Edward grew weaker, skinnier, crazier. Some days, the cage was moved outside. People gawked, children pointed. Lords and ladies threw in food, gold, jewels, anything to humiliate. Other times, the cage was taken to court, so Edward could watch while they mocked him, while they stripped him of his titles, his land, his dignity. All the while, the hum grew louder. It throbbed in Edward's head. Voices started chanting, "Death, death, death." Sometimes he heard laughter, sometimes screams, but mostly, there was silence. Heavy, suffocating, all-consuming silence. And the boy king who had read so much poetry, who had loved so deeply, who had lived a life so full of beauty and song, he learned to hate the silence the most. Edward II died in captivity on September 21, 1327. His body was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, his bones stolen, his memory erased. But does that mean the story ends here? Does it mean history has silenced Edward forever? What about the echo of the hum? What about the whispers in the dark? What about the man who had loved a king? What about the ghost of a broken crown? We want to hear your thoughts. Sound of wind chimes, mixed with quiet singing. Then spoken. This is our channel. We dare to speak what is not spoken. Our podcast is available for free on various platforms. If you love history that bites back, subscribe. And if you want to help us wake the dead, become a member. Your name will appear right here alongside these other legends. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to our supporters for making this episode possible. And remember, history remembers the crown, but it tries to forget what they did to the man who wore it. In the heart of England, nestled between rolling hills and whispering woods, lies a village seemingly untouched by time. Its cobblestone streets and timbered houses are straight out of a medieval tale, and atop a rise overlooking it all sits Berkeley Castle, an imposing structure that has silently witnessed centuries drift by. Its thick stone walls are a testament to countless stories. Some whispered, others roared. But there's one tale that echoes within these ancient stones, one that sends shivers down the spine and leaves visitors breathless. This is the story of King Edward II, the ill-fated monarch whose love for a life well lived, and those he loved cost him everything. Hugh Despenser, having met his demise at the hands of Queen Isabella and her paramour, Roger Mortimer, Edward found himself in grave peril. They didn't kill him right away, because that wasn't the point. They wanted him to feel his downfall, to live every hour knowing what was coming, and that no one would stop it. After Hugh Despenser's execution, they moved Edward to Berkeley Castle, fortress deep in Gloucestershire, surrounded by shadowed hills, far from the court and far from mercy. They locked him in a cold, stone chamber. No light, no attendants, no honor, only the stench of decay, and the sound of rats scratching at the walls. He wasn't just imprisoned, he was unmade, no longer a king, no longer a husband, not even a father, just a problem to be solved. Sound, metal chains dragged across stone, a cold wind whips. But Mortimer and Isabella faced a dilemma. You see, they couldn't just murder him in daylight. That would mean blood on their hands. Regicide, killing a king, was a sin against God. It had to look like an accident, or illness, or divine judgment. They needed to erase him without leaving a mark, at least, not a visible one. For months, Edward languished in the darkness. Some records say he grew sick. Others say he wept daily, asking for his son. But all agree. His jailers were instructed to make him suffer, but leave no trace. They starved him, deprived him of sleep. They let his wounds fester. They let him rot. Yet he survived. Day after day, week after week. A former king, clinging to life in the dark. This persistence became a problem. And Mortimer grew impatient. He whispered to his assassins. He wanted the death to be final and unforgettable. Music shifts low, sinister strings slowly rising beneath each word. And then came the most infamous method of all. A method whispered by monks, written in foreign letters, recorded with a shudder in every historical text that dares to tell it. They say on the night of September 21st, 1327, Edward was awakened. 2 men entered his chamber. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He screamed, he fought, but they pinned him down. And then, they brought forward an object, a hollow metal tube. Polished, narrow, cooled with oil. They forced it between his legs deep into his rectum. He thrashed. He wept. But it was held in place. And then, they brought the second object, a red-hot poker, glowing from the forge, burning orange in the shadows. And without a word, they drove it through the tube. Sound. A single, shrill, metallic hiss. Then a heartbeat. Then silence. The heat traveled upward, burning tissue, severing nerves, cooking him from the inside. Why this method? Because it left no external marks, no wounds, no scars. From the outside, Edward would appear untouched. But inside, he was ruined, destroyed, murdered in the most humiliating, agonizing, and symbolic way imaginable. The message was clear. This was not just death. It was punishment. A brutal declaration that a king who ruled through desire, through softness, through deviance, would be purged by fire. Music fades. All is still. Only breath remains. The next morning, the gods reported he was dead. Natural causes, they said. A lie whispered through centuries. A lie that history tried to bury. But truth has a way of surviving. Even in the medieval world, where violence was routine, where executions were public sport, Edward's death was a horror story. Not just for its cruelty, but for what it meant. It meant that love, when misdirected by power, would be punished. That softness in a king could not be tolerated. That deviation, sexual, political, personal, must be burned out from within. Soundscape. The quiet flicker of candlelight. Pages turning. A monk breathing slowly. And so Edward was buried in Gloucester Cathedral. But no great mourners lined the streets. No monuments were built. He was remembered only in whispers, in records hidden in abbeys, in the shaking hands of chroniclers who dared write what they'd heard. But one detail, one final, horrifying image, remains. They say his screams were heard half a mile away, that the castle echoed with them, that birds fled the trees, and that the flames that night silent and secret burned more than flesh. They burned a man's legacy. Edward II was dead, but in the shadows of England's churches, his ghost remained, not in spirit, but in silence. In the fear etched across every noble face, in the absence no one dared to name. The official report claimed illness, a sudden, tragic decline, a king weakened by sorrow and grief. But rumors spread like fire. Rumors about fire, about screams, about a death too brutal to be divine. In the years that followed, whispers crept into every court. Some said Edward survived, that a body double was killed, that he lived out his days as a monk in Italy, that the Vatican knew and did nothing. Others insisted the story was true, too true, so brutal it had to be real, because who could invent something so vile? Sound, soft scratching of a quill, candle flame flickering. And in every version, one truth remained. What they did to him was not just murder. It was a message, a warning carved in flame, a myth weaponized by the crown. You see, Edward's death did more than end a life. It set a precedent. It became a template for how to erase a ruler without touching a throne. Because Isabella and Mortimer didn't declare a new monarchy. They crowned Edward's son, Edward III. A boy, a puppet, a weapon dressed in royal robes. And behind him stood Mortimer, the true power. The man who'd ordered the poker. The man who now ruled England. But not openly. Not yet. He ruled from the shadows. But shadows do not last. And secrets are rarely kept for long. Sound. Blades being sharpened, hooves galloping in darkness. By 1330, the boy king was a boy no longer. Edward III, just 17, began to suspect the truth. About his father, about Mortimer, about the lies behind the crown on his head. In a dramatic coup, Edward III seized power. Mortimer was arrested, tried and hanged. His body left to rot. His bones scattered. No honors, no tomb, no mercy. As for Isabella, she was spared, but locked away. She lived out her days in quiet exile, wrapped in velvet, haunted by the sound of screaming kings. But even as justice seemed served, the story would not die. Because England remembered, and in that remembering, fear festered. Edward II had not just ruled poorly, he had ruled differently. He had loved differently. He had lived openly, tenderly, rebelliously, in a world that demanded conformity, masculinity, control, and that was his crime. Sound, ticking, breathing, a heartbeat fading in. And so, centuries later, his death became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a tool to scare future kings, to shame future queens, to remind everyone who wore the crown. The throne is not yours, it is England's. And England demands obedience, not affection. Even today, scholars debate the details. Was the poker story a fabrication, a medieval invention, a whispered metaphor for humiliation, or was it real? A hidden truth buried beneath layers of soot and silence? We may never know. But one thing is certain. The pain was real. And so was the fear. Because Edward II's death did not just kill a king. It created a legend. A horror passed down in bone and breath. Soundscape. Rain returns. The low moan of wind through a dungeon corridor. Imagine it. The cold of the floor. The weight of the chain. The taste of rust in the air. The red glow approaching in the dark. The knowledge that no one would stop it. Not the queen. Not the priests. Not God. And as the heat rose inside him, he understood. This was not death. This was erasure. A royal lesson written in fire. If you do not fit the crown, it will melt you from the inside. Time passed. Yet the name Edward II refused to fade. Not because people loved him. Not at all. But because of what had been done to him. Because in every whispered tale, every candlelit confession, there lived a single, burning question. Was it worth it? Was love worth fire? Was softness worth a death so cruel it scarred a nation's memory? The medieval world didn't allow such questions. It taught obedience. Taught power through war, dominance, and fear. A king had to crush. A king had to burn others, not be burned. But Edward chose another path. He chose affection. He chose loyalty. Not to armies, but to companions. And in the eyes of his enemies, that made him dangerous. Not weak, not foolish, but defiant. Isabella and Mortimer never spoke of the method. But the silence was its own confession. What kind of queen signs off on torture? What kind of mother allows her son's father to be reduced to ash from the inside? And what kind of empire watches and says nothing? England said nothing. And that silence grew teeth. It devoured truth. It reshaped the story into something more convenient, more palatable, more useful. Edward became a warning, not a tragedy. A lesson in what not to be. Don't be soft. Don't be gentle. Don't fall in love the wrong way, or the right way, with the wrong people. Don't lose control. Because if you do, you won't just be removed, you'll be destroyed. Music shifts. Tense, mournful strings playing under the rain. And so Edward became the embodiment of the worst-case scenario. Not for rebellion, not for tyranny, but for nonconformity. And while his death was denied, dismissed, doubted, it was never forgotten. Not really. Because history has a way of turning silence into echoes. In 1594, more than 250 years after Edward's death, Christopher Marlowe wrote a play. Edward II. It shocked the audience. Not because of the violence, but because of the love. Marlowe dared to show Edward and Gaveston as more than whispers in a court document. He gave them breath. He gave them pain. He gave them humanity. And by doing so, he forced the world to look again, to remember, to feel. Sound. A page turns. A fire flickers low, casting long shadows. Today, historians still debate. Was the death by red-hot poker real, or symbolic? Was it invented to shame, or preserved because it was real? We'll likely never know. But we do know this. No story endures for 700 years without power. And Edward's story still burns. Not because of how he ruled, but because of how he died. We know what the chronicles say. We know what the church denied. But what about the man? The boy who became king? The lover who became prey? The monarch who became a warning? He was not heroic. Not in the way kings are remembered. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories survive not because of triumph, but because of pain. Soundscape fades to a near silence. Only a single heartbeat remains. Edward II's legacy is carved not in stone, but in fear, in shadows, in fire. And when you walk through Gloucester Cathedral, when you stand before his tomb, tucked quietly away, you can almost feel it. The weight, the shame, the scream that never left the room. Because even now, centuries later, people still look at that grave and whisper, did they really do that? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more historical tales. What they did to Edward II was not justice. It wasn't politics. It was a message. A message so violent, so intimate, so grotesque. It still shivers through the bones of history. Edward wasn't innocent. He made mistakes. He alienated his nobles. He elevated lovers into tyrants. He misread alliances, misjudged enemies, mismanaged war. But his worst sin, in the eyes of his time, He blurred the lines between king and lover, between ruler and companion, between man and weakness. He didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be understood. And in return, they gave him flames. But fire does not destroy memory. Sometimes it preserves it. And what remains of Edward is not just a name in a chronicle. It's a feeling, a tension, a mirror we are still afraid to look into. Because centuries later, his story still warns us. Not about rebellion, not about weakness, but about the price of being different in a world that demands you be the same. There are those who say the story of the red-hot poker was fabricated, a smear, a rumor weaponized by his enemies. And maybe it was. But ask yourself this: why did the world believe it so easily? Why did the chroniclers record it with such detail? Why did it echo for centuries in courts and churches and cathedrals? Because no matter how strange, how awful, how inhuman it sounded, it made sense to them. They believed a man like Edward could meet an end like that, and that belief is its own horror. Long pause. Then when you strip away the royal title, the court, the crown, the legacy, what's left? A man begging in the dark, burning from the inside out, screaming with no one to hear him. And the silence that followed was more permanent than any grave. Because England didn't just kill a king, it destroyed a voice. And that is why we tell this story. Because here in the shadows of forgotten thrones, there are warnings we must not ignore. Histories they tried to bury, names they tried to erase, truths too disturbing for textbooks. Here at the channel, we dig deeper. We find the cracks in the foundation. We listen to the screams between the lines. We remember those who were forgotten, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Every week we bring you new videos, true stories they never wanted told. Edward's story is one of many this year. We're bringing you forgotten histories from around the world. Tales of tyrants and treachery, revolutions and resistance, crimes against humanity and acts of unexpected, even indecent courage. Comment below, who should we resurrect next? Because history isn't over. It just sleeps, waiting to be heard again. Sound. Bells toll slowly, then fade under final whispered voice. In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where Edward once held court, a single flickering candle casts long shadows on the stone walls. It's here in the darkness that we hear the echoes of his tormented soul. A soul that dared to dream of a world where a king could be more than a figurehead. Where power and passion could coexist without consequence. But as the candle flickers and fades, we are left with nothing but the cold comfort of knowing that Edward's story is not just a relic of the past, but a warning for the future. A reminder that even in the darkest depths of history, the fight for love, acceptance and understanding is worth having. For even if the flames may consume us, our stories will live on in the whispers of the wind, carried on the backs of those brave enough to seek them out. Because history isn't over, it just sleeps, waiting to be heard again. All of us have the power to shape history. Every like, comment and share helps keep these stories alive and ensures that history doesn't sleep, it just wakes up. As the final notes of the bells fade away, leaving only the sound of your breath and the beating of your heart, I invite you to join me in this journey through time. Subscribe to the channel and become part of our ever-growing family of history enthusiasts. Together, we can unearth the forgotten, the silenced, and the ignored, and bring them back into the light where they belong. Thank you.